With just 1 week to go until the presidential election, our nation's gaze is locked on the federal showdown. But while the spotlight blazes on Washington, it's very easy for us all to overlook the major election impacts that are happening right in our own backyards. In today's episode, Dan and I are going to flip the script, and we're going to explore the local regulations that are impacting the commercial and industrial real estate landscape. From building performance standards to New York's ambitious Local Law 97, and here in Southern California, the game-changing WARE program. Join us as we uncover how these under-the-radar policies could impact your business more than any headline grabbing the federal mandate. Dan, welcome back.
Good to be here. Good to see you again. Thanks, Gareth.
I know we talk about this quite a lot, but work-life integration is key to our existence. I know you managed to get out and disconnect from work for a weekend. How was it?
It was excellent. Yeah, it was actually we recorded a podcast from my digs in southern Utah. Me and 7 of my friends were able to get out and have a pretty incredible golf weekend. There was, like I said, 8 of us total. We golfed Friday, Saturday, Sunday at 3 incredible courses. One that is hands down for all of us the nicest course we've ever played. We were in St. George, Utah. The one that was very, very incredible was called Sand Hollow. And it was pretty cool because it wasn't the course that the PGA Tour played at, but the PGA Tour was in St. George the weekend prior to us being there.
Oh, wow.
And the wild thing, though, was our first day, really our first 2 days, the wind was just ripping. It was pretty consistent 25, 30 mile an hour winds with 40 to 50 mile an hour gusts, which proves to be pretty challenging to hit a golf ball in. And you feel like a hero when you're playing downwind holes, but you feel like a chump when you're going upwind and you can only hit it not quite over 150 yards. So it was fun. We had a blast, and it was really good to take a step back, reflect on all that we're doing here, and get recharged to close out the year strong.
Yeah, nice.
How about yourself, Gareth? I know you got outside and into the wilderness.
Yeah, it's been a really great few weeks. I think you alluded to the fact one of our investors and I managed to get out into the backcountry. We went west of Bishop for a 4-day backpacking trip, right up into a really remote part of the Eastern Sierras called the Palisades Basin. So up at over 11,000 feet, super amazing. No birds, no flies, no noise. It was kind of eerie, just surrounded by mega old school rock outcrops that are quite overwhelming when you have to climb up them. So tough few days dealing with trying to sleep at altitude and grind it out through all backcountry stuff. So no trails, finding our own routes and being out there. But it was an amazing way to kind of let the mind run, disconnect. And since I've managed to kind of get back into the groove of a couple of really good weeks of hitting the gym, getting the nutrition right before hitting the road on traveling for work again, which always throws an extra spanner in the works. So I'll report on that next time, how to manage traveling and trying to sustain some degree of a healthy lifestyle. But Dan, let's jump right into it. Locally, there's a lot going on. Most people don't even know some of the things that are happening that can impact their businesses. Do you want to start by talking us through what building performance standards are?
Certainly. So I think before I dive too deep into this, as we go through these 3 examples, there's many others, but I think it's really important. Commercial real estate asset owners are facing a major challenge because if you're trying to manage one property, you can start to get your hands around all of the regulations and incentives that are impacting that. But when you're talking about a portfolio of hundreds or thousands of properties, it can become rather unwieldy. And unlike businesses that are maybe a bit more have the ability to be a bit more mobile, whether they're professional services or other businesses, those that own or occupy large commercial real estate properties can't really move. You can't pick up a building and move it somewhere else. So you are at the mercy of the local carrots and sticks, if you will, or regulations and incentives. And so one of those that has been gaining a lot of momentum over the last really 10 years, but much more so over the last, say, 3 or 4 years, has been this concept of building performance standards or building energy performance standards. And really what these are, they're becoming increasingly common in cities, so enacted by cities, but also we're starting to see them in states. And what they are is really focused on addressing the carbon impact of the built environment. And they're often written in such ways that they are more outcome-based rather than the measures or tactics taken to reach those outcomes. And so they're typically structured in a way where they set a baseline year of emissions for a particular property or a standard for that type of property, and then set targets in future years of how much carbon emissions or energy use intensity these buildings need to reach. And if they don't, then they start to face fines. And in some cases, the fines can be somewhat nominal, and in other cases, they can be rather impactful for non-compliance. And so when we look across the country, as I mentioned, there's a variety of places that have already passed them. And again, they can be either energy focused or emissions focused or both. And then there's many other places that have started to have them under consideration. And so, for example, here in Southern California, Chula Vista has enacted one. There's actually quite a few across Colorado. Cities like Denver, Boulder, Aspen have enacted them. And then there's also a statewide initiative. Washington, D.C. has a major one that I'll touch on in a minute. And then there's a handful of other cities and states that have already enacted these. And oftentimes they start with the biggest buildings. So typically you'll see 250,000 square feet or 100,000 square feet and above. And then in future years, they start to get further and further down into smaller and smaller building types. So they're affecting more and more of the built environment in those particular areas. And so if I was to dig in a little bit on the building energy performance standard in Washington, D.C., for example, the BEPS program, the first standard came out impacting buildings that were greater than 50,000 square feet, as well as DC owned buildings, so the government buildings as well. And the fines, though, I think this is the important thing to be cognizant of, is that for buildings that did not meet the energy performance standards, and those were largely, there's a couple different pathways that you could follow down. I'll share one, the performance pathway, where essentially it says that the site must reduce its energy use by 20% during the cycle that was identified. And non-compliance of reaching that standard, you could face financial penalties of up to $10 per square foot of building area. That starts to get really big when we're talking 100,000 plus square feet of building. We're in the millions of dollars in fines. And so, for example, the policy currently applies to buildings that are privately owned over 50,000 square feet. And starting in 2027, the policy will apply to privately owned buildings that are larger than 25,000 square feet. Like I said, there's a couple different pathways that you can go down. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think the important thing is to know that large commercial real estate asset owners or large businesses that have a commercial real estate footprint are likely going to be impacted by some of these performance standards. The other examples, for argument's sake, are like in Chula Vista here in California. 2023, it was impacting buildings over 50,000 square feet. 2026, it's buildings over 27,000 square feet, with goals of 57% reduction in emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2045. While these don't necessarily prescribe the methods of doing so, they do provide some guidance. On-site renewables certainly being one of them. Doing energy efficiency audits and bringing in better performance HVAC systems and lighting systems can help you achieve some of these benefits. And again, it's important to know whether your local municipality has enacted an energy standard, an emission standard, or one that blends the two and has a bit of both. So it's really imperative that building owners understand what is impacting them. And then as you look at deploying some of these opportunities, whether it be on-site renewables or energy efficiency type of projects, really building these essentially financial penalty avoidance into your business cases. Because that, while we talk a lot about energy rates going up and incentives are great, avoiding a pretty hefty fine, especially the one that I described there in Washington, D.C., can really help boost the economics of one of these projects and really drive forward the decision-making process within capital allocation committees, within boardrooms. And so it's, I think, an important bit. And these are always driven. The statewide ones are driven by state legislators. City ones are driven by city supervisors. And so when you're looking at your local ballot, beyond the federal initiatives and beyond the presidential election, understand that the folks that you vote into these positions may have an outsized impact on your local buildings. So Gareth, similarly, but a little different because it's maybe a bit of a broader swath of area. Talk to us about the WARE program here in Southern California.
Yeah, I definitely will, Dan. Just on the building performance standards, I was actually chatting to a guy who owns a bunch of fast food restaurants in Denver. He owns like 13 to date, and he's run them for the last 20 years. And he'd never heard of anything like this. And he went to build a new restaurant, and he was told that it had to be 20% more efficient in energy terms than the current plan. And he went to market a few times, and he actually couldn't get anyone to help him achieve that. And he was just churning on that. And so this is part of the challenge for business owners who aren't thinking about this proactively, is then trying to react in real time because he's nervous about being penalized, not being able to open the restaurant. And finally, he managed to find someone that was able to design a system for them. They stubbed in a bunch of EV chargers as well to help him attract more customers, but they hadn't thought about that in terms of their design. And the utility then said, we don't have enough energy to support you. And so, it's really important that business leaders think about this early, often, and strategically plan and on in that kind of knee-jerk reaction mode, because that's when you get left in this churn cycle, which is just painful and expensive and time-consuming, and you can't open your business when you're expected. So super important. Thanks for sharing, Dan. The WARE program in Southern California, I actually managed to meet a really interesting lady from the South Coast Air Quality Management District, which is here in Southern California. And she gave me some really interesting insights into this program. I think what you've highlighted this, Dan, is these things kind of glide under the radar. Like, we're in the energy industry, and this wasn't even on my radar until the last year, but it's been out since 2021. And really kind of went into action in 2022. And what the WARE program is the Warehouse Actions and Investments to Reduce Emissions program. And so for those who are interested, the South Coast Air Quality Management District enforces this. And from an election perspective, to build on your point, is that of the 13 members that make up the governing board for the air quality management, 10 of those are elected officials. So really important to make sure that this is part of your consideration. And the program actually applies to all warehouses over 100,000 square feet. So this is over 3,400 facilities here in California right now. It was really officially rolled out in 2022. And phase one was targeting any warehouse over 250,000 square feet. Now this year, that has rolled down to 100 to 150,000 square feet. And from 2025 onwards, they want to make sure all warehouses are matching this WARE program. And what it's about is just trying to drive these warehouses to reduce their emissions profile. And largely that's focused on reducing truck trips. And so, or reducing their emissions through other means. And so the whole purpose of the program is every warehouse now has to actually count how many trucks are coming and going from their warehouse. They have to then calculate an emissions profile related to that or report against it. And then they have to offset those emissions accordingly or reduce them. And operators are responsible for all of this. And it's a point-based system. And the points are quite interesting. So it's the warehouse size times the annual amount of truck trips times by a weighting factor that's given to us by the air quality district. Then you get a number of points, and you can try and offset those points by any means that you so choose, whether that be electrifying fleets or forklift trucks, whether it's installing solar, batteries, any of these emission reduction strategies. But for any point offset between the points you earn versus the points you manage to achieve through deploying any of these initiatives, it's $1,000 a point. And, based on the fact that this is warehouse size and truck trip initiated, this can mount up very quickly. And I think to your point before, Dan, no one really wants to incur these penalties because that's just completely dead money. You may as well be investing that in actually adding value to your property and gaining the benefits of reducing your energy costs and reducing your emissions and being more resilient versus just ignoring it, not reporting against it, and then getting hit with a big fine. And one big example that she shared was Maersk and Prologis at one of their facilities now had 93 zero emission trucks. So this is being really embraced by some of the bigger players. But for many of the warehouses, they're not even aware of it yet. And so what she had shared was reporting has been quite challenging. I think they've got 70% reporting rates right now. I imagine the other 30% probably don't even know about the program, even though they're trying to educate more and more people all the time. And from an election and a legal perspective, this was actually legally challenged, this ruling. And ultimately, the rule was upheld in court and now forms part of the state's implementation plan. And because the EPA approval, because the federal enforcement has been approved, the EPA can now also really try and enforce it. So it's serious, and businesses need to be aware of it, and they need to make sure that they are proactively reporting, managing the rule, reducing traffic or truck trips as much as possible. And then where they can't, because they're a business trying to operate, they need to try and offset those emissions as much as possible. So super interesting. Dan, do you want to share another really interesting program, which is Local Law 97 up in New York?
Yeah, and this is actually another example, I would say, of these building performance standards. It's just at the extreme level of New York City, and they've already brought it down to buildings of 25,000 square feet or greater, which is a huge cross section of the buildings there in New York City. So back in April of 2019, the New York City Council. I bring that up because, again, this is the local elections that we're talking about here, passed what was called the Climate Mobilization Act. And it was a package of legislation with really ambitious actions to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in the city. I read something somewhere that said buildings account for 2/3 of the emissions in New York City specifically, which is pretty staggering, which is what was driving this whole initiative. And at the core of the Climate Mobilization Act was this Local Law 97, which requires most buildings over 25,000 square feet to meet the greenhouse gas emissions limits by 2024. With more stricter limits coming in 2020 and 2030. And ultimately, the goal is getting to carbon neutrality by 2050. And so the compliance timelines are designed to give building owners and managers enough time to integrate projects and align with their replacement and refinancing cycles. But ultimately, it's really focused on driving down the carbon emissions of the city. The thing I wanted to touch on with this was, like I said, it's impacting buildings that are larger than 25,000 square feet. And really, when you start to think about the fines, they've really put in, so 2024, this is a really big year for them. They've put in a handful of fines. So first and foremost, the buildings are required to report on their emissions. And so that's a huge undertaking in its own right. And there's a huge industry growing on reporting on your building's emissions. But failure to file a report, you start to incur fines of 50 cents per building square foot per month of not reporting. So they're already putting in teeth to make sure that they can collect the data. And then for exceeding your emissions limits, you're going to pay roughly $268 for each metric ton over the building's established limit. And there's a variety of different limits for different building types. There's also a fine for providing false statements because they realize that this is a self-reporting activity. And if they catch anybody providing false statements, that's a $500,000 fine. A bit of a breakdown. So if we take an example of a 50,000 square foot multifamily residential building, you'd be looking at over the time period from 2024 to 2029 a fine of around $20,000, which doesn't seem like a ton, but when you start to amplify that of buildings that are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of square feet, those can be pretty staggering. Now, the challenge in New York City is you've got a very, very kind of built up environment versus a widespread environment. And so they're having to get creative with their ability to reduce emissions. And there's been a lot of innovation on the building energy efficiency side of things, HVAC, because you don't have these massive warehouses per se, like a lot of places where you can throw large scale on-site renewables on. So I think it's just another example, I think an amplified example of these building performance standards, but there's a lot of cities scattered around the country and other jurisdictions that are seeing these programs and seeing them start to get implemented and are either considering this legislation, or you're starting to see the rumblings of it work its way through their systems and ultimately get considered and either enacted or voted upon. So really interesting. And again, I think I really feel for the asset owners of very large portfolios because they don't just have to track one of these, they have to track all of these, and the impacts on their bottom line can be pretty staggering. So beyond these three examples that we gave, Gareth, there are a couple other elections and pieces of local ballots that are noteworthy here as we move on to November 5th.
Yeah, there's a load going on that has implications for the energy and sort of decarbonization industries. I think there's four that really stand out. Roy Cooper, who's the governor in Northern California, he's now reached his term limit. So he's been really pushing very ambitious clean energy initiatives. He's really incentivized the use of electric vehicles, and he's been ordering a lot of the agencies to take more action on climate change. And so he can't apply again, or whatever the US term would be for that, being a non-US resident or citizen. I'm not sure but he's come to the end of his term, and there's two potential candidates that can replace him. The Governor Mark Robinson, or Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, he's famous for saying that climate change is a hoax, and he wants to really support greater extraction of fossil fuels. And then on the other side, we've got Democratic Attorney General Josh Stein, and he's been prosecuting a lot of polluters, and he's very keen to continue to push Roy Cooper's climate and energy agenda and seek a path to carbon neutrality by 2050 for the state. So you can see very divergent opinions, and it could really impact, I suppose, the future direction of Northern Carolina. Dan, next.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, North Carolina governor election there with Roy Cooper. Big elections in Pennsylvania. So the attorney generals in several states play a major role in energy policy, both on prosecuting oil and gas producers for emissions and their misleading climate claims. And so in Pennsylvania, which is the country's number 2 natural gas producer, there's a really tight race between the Democrat Eugene DePasquale, who has a long history of strong climate policy, and a Republican named David Sunday, who has really not expressed a position on climate change or sustainability. But the previous Attorney General, Josh Shapiro, was really praised by environmentalists for his tough approach to polluters. So interesting to see the attorney generals and the way that they go after large corporations is going to pan out in this election.
Yeah, and then we've got in some of the key battleground states, Dan, Arizona, Michigan, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania, the control over the state legislature is up for debate. And this is where climate and energy policy is really hashed out. And it's very tightly contested. And this is super important because 53% of the US population lives in states and territories with today 100% clean energy goals. And so that's a real, that has a major implication on the direction these states take. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in those battleground states and see which direction they take.
Yeah. And then lastly, there's some ballot initiatives. So beyond electing individuals to certain offices, right here in our own backyard here in California, there's a Proposition 4, which is really more focused on how do we start to pay for and clean up the challenges associated with the changing climate. And so this Prop 4 would allow the state of California to borrow $10 billion by issuing bonds for water projects, wildfire prevention, protection from extreme heat, and as well as sea level rise. And so the initiative is in response to the growing impact of climate change. And the estimates around this is that the state could be paying over $100 billion a year by 2050 to deal with its effects. So it's really interesting to see a combination of elected officials and the regulations that they can be pushing, some of these building performance standards and WARE programs that are trying to mitigate the root cause of some of these issues, and then propositions getting put on the ballot to try to fund some of the, quote unquote, cleanup or dealing with some of the challenges associated with it. So I think that this has been I've always heard from people much wiser than myself that the federal elections, especially the presidential election, get all the coverage, but really the rubber hits the road and things are really happening at the local level. And this could not be more true here in the energy and the decarbonization space.
Yeah, it's interesting times. Can't personally vote myself, but following it super closely. And I think it just really highlights, doesn't it, Dan, is that there are carrots and there are sticks. And there's lots of reasons. We keep using this term recently, fiduciary responsibility. Like there's a huge fiduciary responsibility for businesses to be considering the cost, opportunities, and implications for their businesses. And there are mega opportunities today to deliver significant value for our companies, our businesses, our properties. But increasingly, there's risks associated with it. So we need to be hyper aware of that and not fall foul of being either naive about what's going on or not tracking it or just not being able to respond accordingly. And so we see this a lot, and we want to continue to support all our customers to assess across mega portfolios, like where is there a risk, where's an opportunity, what should you do, why should you do it, and who should you do it with.
100%. We feel for them. Get out there and vote.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gary.
See ya.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.